John Lennon will always be remembered as a musical genius, but the Beatles star had a far darker side that has frightened his followers over the years.
John Lennon's legacy has always been celebrated, but there are secrets about his career that you've probably never heard before. What is the media not telling you about his rise to fame and the choices he made? From his turbulent beginnings to his controversial moves after the Beatles, Lennon's path to stardom wasn't a smooth ride. Stay tuned, because we're about to uncover the shocking side of John Lennon's career that most people have overlooked. What the media is hiding about Lennon's early struggles. We know the story of how John Lennon rose into the limelight through forming a band called the Beatles, which broke into music stardom. What if I told you there's more to his early years than you've heard? It wasn't as glamorous as headlines would have seemed. In fact, Lennon's journey had a lot of obstacles tacked onto it that were well kept from the public eye. Let's get a closer look into one part of Lennon's life which most of the world never knew. Lennon wasn't a stranger to hardship. The post-war Liverpool slums certainly made for a less than easy childhood. His father abandoned the family when he was a young boy, leaving his mother to raise him alone. However, Lennon's relationship with his mother was complicated in that she was aloof and struggled with mental health issues. Mostly, Lennon was left to his own devices, spending much of his youth in foster homes and with family members. This early emotional instability and lack of family support provided the foundation for many of his struggles later on. Prior to the success of the Beatles, Lennon was having a hard time finding his voice and direction. He had been in a number of bands, but nothing really made it. He wasn't the suave, confident musician that the world came to know. He was a young, angry, and partially rebellious young man trying to find his spot. The sharp wit and facility with words that would serve Lennon so well sometimes got him into trouble, and the abrasive personality that went along with the package wasn't always particularly endearing to other industry individuals. Despite these setbacks, Lennon was driven. He wanted to make big, but it wasn't until he formed the Beatles with Paul McCartney, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr that he actually began to make a name for himself. But even with the Beatles rising to stardom, Lennon was always at odds, it seemed, with his bandmates. Many people probably don't realize that John Lennon wasn't always on the best of terms with the others, at least during the early days of their success. Behind closed doors, though, feelings of jealousy and rivalry ran high, along with deep personal struggles. Additionally, Lennon's personal life was one chaotic whirlwind. A voracious reader, influenced by political movements and searching for deeper meaning, his artistic growth was more often than not overshadowed by the pressure to be the Beatle the world wanted him to be. He wasn't just a musician, he was also an artist fighting with identity and his role in life. It was this internal battle that fueled many of the creative tensions within the Beatles. On the other hand, Lennon had to strike a balance between being an artist who is representative of himself and living with the constant expectations from fans as his popularity kept on growing. Among the first challenges that Lennon faced early in his career was the vision of the public, a vision he would call the bad boy of the Beatles. Whereas McCartney was often the charming one, and Harrison the quiet one, Lennon was the loud-mouthed rebel. But what most media rarely, if ever, reported was how much this persona took a toll on him. Behind the scenes, Lennon was a deeply sensitive person, and the weight of the public eye lay heavily on him. The biting humor, the often off-putting controversial comments, these weren't acts of defiance but his way of coping with the overwhelming stress and pressure that comes with being in the spotlight. The truth is, the struggles of Lennon weren't about rising to fame, but surviving emotionally and psychologically in an industry that didn't care about the mental health of its stars. To make matters worse, his abrasive persona and media portrayals of him as the angry Beatle further added to his feelings of isolation. Suffice it to say, Lennon's battle was not with the public or his bandmates, it was with his demons. What then did the media leave out of Lennon's story? They missed the raw, unheard struggles that molded him into the artist he grew up to be. In the case of Lennon's rise to fame, his family was broken. Internal fights and isolation filled his childhood. All of those were part of the untold truth. The media loved the image of the rebellious Beatle, but the reality was far more complicated and far darker than anyone realized. What most people don't know about Lennon's battle with fame. John Lennon, revolutionary, cultural icon, and voice of a generation. We know the legend, the Beatle who helped shape the 60s and whose music echoed the hopes and dreams of millions. But what most people don't recognize is the hidden cost of his fame, the side of Lennon that was molded not by his accomplishments, but by the huge pressure that fame placed upon his soul. Lennon's career skyrocketed to the level of world superstardom, but with fame came a ferocity he had never anticipated. The constant media attacks, the unending requests from fans, and the loss of privacy engulfed him. Behind the rebel with a cause stood a man unable to escape his own celebrity. And what was he prepared to pay? Himself, his relationships, and sometimes even his very identity. When we think of Lennon, we most often envision the confident voice for peace and change, but the reality was far more complicated. Fame had forced Lennon into a struggle against a version of himself that was barely recognizable. Early in the Beatles' ascension, Lennon had to come to grips with the band's blossoming success and with the growing expectation from the world. He wasn't a musician, he was an icon, a voice of revolution. That's a mantle that carries with it a lot of weight. While it's true he reveled in this role of cultural icon, there was a cost. And this pressure to constantly live up to the expectations of millions produced a deep inner turmoil. More often than not, Lennon found himself torn between his artistic ambitions and the public's perception of him. Every word and action of Lennon in his role as the bad boy of the Beatles was under scrutiny. He was never really given the space to just be himself. That contrast between his public self and the person he was in private grew into a frustrating feeling. His more famous eruptions and quick remarks were not just acts of rebellion, but cries for release. It was his way of pushing back against a system that had swallowed him whole. All this fame came at a heavy cost to his personal relationships. For example, his marriage with Cynthia Lennon began to dissolve under the weight of public scrutiny. Fame drove a wedge between them, and it wasn't just the temptations of stardom that strained their relationship. In an attempt to escape the madness, Lennon retreated deeper into himself, leaving little emotional room for his wife. Only that strong public pressure can be expected to have further fractured those already fractured relations. Fame didn't just change Lennon's relationships, it recast his perception of them. He started wondering if people saw him for who he was, or just the Lennon of the Beatles. So did Lennon's relationship with his bandmates. By the time the Beatles had reached the height of their powers, Lennon had grown disenchanted with both fame and the direction in which the band was heading. Growing dissatisfaction with the superficiality of stardom made him long for something more meaningful. He didn't want to be just a Beatle anymore. He wanted to explore more meaningful avenues in life, both in music and beyond. This would also lead to creative tensions within the band as Lennon sought new forms of expression that didn't fit the formulaic pop music of the Beatles' earlier years. But what Lennon didn't realize at the time was that fame would inflict far deeper wounds than he could ever have imagined. In trying to redefine himself, the crushing truth slowly began to dawn on him that his public image was inextricably woven into his self-identity. His battles with the pressures of fame were not just personal, they were artistic, and these struggles clearly reflected in his music, since songs like Help or I'm a Loser testified to his internal suffering. Though he did find solace in his personal life later, particularly with Yoko Ono, it wasn't until much later in his career that he found any real peace with his fame. In many respects, Lennon's move to quit the Beatles was a direct response to the stifling nature of stardom. Yet in his solo career, he was never really free from the shadow of fame. He remained the public's icon, even as he struggled to redefine himself in private. What we've learned from Lennon's battle with fame is that it's not just about the perks of success, It's about the toll it takes on one's psyche. Fame, for Lennon, wasn't the ultimate triumph, it was the ultimate burden. The shocking truth. Lennon's ex-girlfriend reveals about their relationship. John Lennon's love life has always been a subject of intrigue. But what do we really know about his relationships, especially the one with May Pang, his former girlfriend? Pang's perspective offers a side of Lennon's life that the media often overlooked, until now. Lennon's relationship with Pang, which lasted from 1973 to 1975, has been shrouded in mystery. For many, it's been eclipsed by his tumultuous marriage to Yoko Ono. But Pang's revelations about their time together challenge the narrative we've been sold about Lennon's personal life and his career. What really happened during these 2 years of Lennon's life? May Pang was more than just a lover. She was a confidant, a supporter, and in many ways, the person who helped Lennon reconnect with himself. At the time, Lennon was navigating a period of emotional turmoil. His relationship with Yoko Ono had hit a rough patch, and Lennon was in search of some form of normalcy away from the constant spotlight. In Pang, he found someone who wasn't blinded by his fame or caught up in his celebrity. But what the public didn't know was that their relationship was deeply complicated and filled with contradictions. In her memoir, Pang reveals how Lennon's fame was both a blessing and a curse. Despite his stardom, Lennon was at his most vulnerable during their time together. Pang recounts how Lennon often spoke about the loneliness that came with being one of the most famous men in the world. His fame isolated him, and Pang became his emotional anchor. But their relationship wasn't without its challenges. Lennon's personal demons, compounded by his public persona, often led to conflicts, with Pang caught in the crossfire. What really makes Pang's story so shocking is her honest portrayal of Lennon's struggles with himself and his career. The man who once said, "Give peace a chance," was also grappling with internal contradictions that ran much deeper than anyone knew. Pang reveals that Lennon wasn't always the idealistic peacemaker many believed him to be. Beneath the public figure was a man who at times was lost and uncertain about where he fit in the world. Pang's stories offer a raw, unfiltered look into Lennon's personal battles that were often hidden behind his carefully crafted public image. Her revelations also shed light on how Lennon's relationship with Yoko Ono affected his music and career. While Ono was often blamed for causing friction within the Beatles, Pang's perspective suggests that Lennon's need for independence and self-discovery was far more complex. Pang also highlights how Lennon's relationship with her influenced some of his most significant solo work, especially songs like Mind Games and Whatever Gets You Through the Night. These songs, which marked a significant departure from his earlier work with the Beatles, reflect a Lennon who was struggling with identity and seeking authenticity in an increasingly commercialized world. The most shocking part of Pang's story is the extent to which she helped Lennon rediscover his creativity. During their time together, Lennon started to get back into music in ways he hadn't in years. Pang wasn't just his lover, she was also his muse, inspiring him to pursue his artistic ambitions once again. In her recollections, Pang pulls back the curtain on Lennon's private life, revealing that there was much more to him than the iconic, peace-loving revolutionary. The truth about Lennon's personal struggles is far more complicated than the public image he carefully cultivated. And Pang's revelations give us a glimpse of the man behind the legend. The man who, despite his fame and success, was still searching for meaning in his life. The shocking truth about Lennon's lost weekend. The name carved into the annals of rock history is John Lennon's Lost Weekend. But what did that madcap year really consist of? Was it truly a period of rebellion and excess, or was there something deeper at play? Fasten your seatbelts. What you're about to hear may change how you view Lennon's infamous year away from Yoko Ono. Lost Weekend is what's come to describe the mid-1970s when Lennon split from his wife Yoko Ono and really just left the public imagining what was happening behind closed doors. Most think of it as a time of wild parties, excess alcohol, and brief romantic trysts, most of all with May Pang. But what if we told you that the story you know is only half the picture? The so-called lost weekend of Lennon was anything but an escape to Yoko. self-discovery, creative experimentation, and emotional turmoil went on behind the highly publicized media coverage. The period away from Ono was much more than a mistake in judgment for Lennon. It was a transitional moment in his life, personally and professionally. Rather than being self-destructive, this period was really one of change. Separation from Yoko gave Lennon an opportunity to come out of the Beatles' shadow and re-identify himself as an independent artist. With music being his perfect outlet, he began to dive deeply into it, and the results were far from less than revolutionary. While most remember his infamous drinking and partying during this time, Lennon was equally experimenting with new sounds and ideas. That was the era that gave birth to Mind Games, quite different from the work he had done in the Beatles era. Rather than the expression of chaos, it was Lennon's balancing act, the fame, the inner demons, and his evolving identity as an artist. He was no longer just John Lennon, Beatle. He was John Lennon, the man fighting with his own persona. But what went unseen by the general public was the battle within Lennon's mind. The media took a man lost in a haze of alcohol and failed relationships and minimized this reality. Lennon was facing his own alienation, which had been reinforced by the death of his mother and his growing disillusionment with fame. He wasn't rebelling only against Yoko or the legacy of the Beatles, but was trying to find himself outside of everybody else's perceptions. In fact, time away from Yoko stirred Lennon's most personal and unbridled artistic expression. His album Rock and Roll, recorded at the time, was an expression of his search to reconnect with his musical roots, showing us a Lennon so much more than the troubled celebrity. He was a man coming to terms with a painful past that continued to haunt him yet shape him at the same time. What Lennon went through during his Lost Weekend was this nice mix of artistic frustration, emotional growth, and personal breakdowns, all that the media would often hardly look upon. He was not just a man who drowned himself in self-destruction. He was an artist pushing boundaries in search of peace within the chaos, Lennon's musical reinvention. John Lennon was a man who reinvented himself more times than most artists would dare to dream of. But one shift in his career stands out as a true game-changer, a shift so seismic that it's often overlooked in discussions of his legacy. The Lennon we knew as part of the Beatles was a far cry from the artist who emerged post-Beatles. But did the public really understand the transformation he underwent? Let's take a deep dive into the career shift that changed everything for Lennon. After the Beatles disbanded in 1970, Lennon faced the monumental challenge of stepping out from under the world's most famous band's shadow. What most people don't realize is that this wasn't just about continuing his music career, it was about reinvention. Lennon didn't want to just be another ex-Beatle. He wanted to forge his own path, challenge the norms, and explore a sound that was uniquely his, and that's exactly what he did. Lennon's early solo work, such as John Lennon Plastic Ono Band 1970, marked a dramatic shift in both style and substance. This wasn't the polished pop music of the Beatles. This was raw, introspective, and at times brutal. The album reflected Lennon's personal battles, his experiences with his parents, his fame, and his deep, almost philosophical questions about life. This wasn't just an album, it was an exorcism of Lennon's demons. Tracks like Mother and Isolation revealed a side of Lennon that the world had never seen before. A man vulnerable, searching for meaning and wrestling with his past. But Lennon didn't stop there. As his solo career progressed, so did his sound. Enter the album Mind Games, 1973, which marked yet another departure from his previous work. The music was still deeply personal, but it was also more experimental. Lennon was now incorporating elements of rock, pop, and even psychedelia, creating a more commercial sound while still maintaining that intimate, honest quality in his lyrics. This wasn't just a musical transformation, it was a declaration. Lennon was no longer trying to emulate the Beatles. He was making music that reflected who he was as an individual and who he wanted to become as an artist. In many ways, Lennon's post-Beatles work mirrored the evolution of his personal life. He wasn't just changing musically, he was becoming more open, more willing to experiment, and more ready to challenge the expectations of his fans. His music was no longer just about revolution. It was about self-reflection and vulnerability. Lennon's shift in direction during this period wasn't just about his artistic growth. It was about redefining who he was in the eyes of the world. But the shift didn't end there. Lennon's collaboration with Yoko Ono in the late 1970s showed us a Lennon who was no longer confined by conventional rock norms. It was a period of experimentation as he embraced avant-garde sounds, political activism, and of course, his family life. His later work, including tracks like Happy Xmas, War Is Over, showed a Lennon who had fully embraced the role of both artist and activist, using his platform to spread messages of peace and hope. What you may not realize is that Lennon's career was a constant evolution. Each phase of his life and career was a deliberate attempt to break free from the past and define who he was as an artist. It wasn't just about success, it was about self-discovery. And that's what makes Lennon's career so fascinating, a journey of constant reinvention that ultimately culminated in his tragic and untimely death. John Lennon's life and career will forever be full of untold stories. What secrets are still waiting to be uncovered about his legacy? It's clear that Lennon's journey was far from the polished narrative we've been fed for decades. If these shocking truths about Lennon's career surprised you, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Share your thoughts below, and join us as we continue to reveal the untold stories of music legends. Don't forget to hit that bell icon so you never miss the truth behind the fame.